Welcome to Unholy Inquiry, where each tale leads you deeper into a labyrinth of mystery waiting to be uncovered. This time, join us as we delve into Hercule Poirot and the Rose That Cut Deep, a fan-crafted story that pays homage to the genius and sophistication of Agatha Christie's iconic detective, Hercule Poirot. We are thrilled to have you with us on this captivating journey. Share your thoughts, let us know where you're tuning in from, and if you spot any details we missed, your feedback is invaluable. Together, let's continue to shape even more thrilling enigmas. Chapter 1. The Blood-Red Thorn. The thunder rumbled in the distance, its ominous sound reverberating through the house like the final warning of an inevitable storm. The rain lashed against the windows, a relentless cascade that blurred the world outside. Inside, however, a peculiar silence lingered, a silence so thick it almost felt oppressive. It was shattered abruptly by a scream, a sharp, blood-curdling cry, so raw with fear and despair that it seemed to shake the very foundations of the old manor. The woman stood frozen in the doorway, her hand clutching at her throat as her gaze fixed on the lifeless body before her. Her lips quivered, but no sound came. Her wide eyes stared unblinking at the sight of her husband's lifeless form sprawled across the floor, his once splendid suit now soaked in crimson, and beside him a single blood-red rose lay, its petals pristine, untouched by the chaos surrounding it. But it was the thorn, sharp and cruel, that drew her gaze. It gleamed with a glistening drop of blood, as though mocking the death it had just witnessed. The detective had already arrived. His arrival, so precise, so unhurried, was as if the storm outside had no bearing on his temperament. Hercule Poirot stood at the threshold, his presence commanding, his gaze sharp as ever. He took in the scene with a studied calmness that contrasted sharply with the hysteria of the room. His mustache twitched, and he adjusted his bow tie with meticulous care, as though he had not just entered a crime scene, but rather a gathering of old friends. "Mon Dieu," Poirot muttered to himself, his voice a soft yet precise whisper. A rose, but a blood-red thorn. How very poetic. He stepped forward, his polished shoes barely making a sound on the creaky wooden floor. His eyes scanned the room, lingering on the woman, her face pale with shock, and then on the corpse. His fingers splayed out, as though reaching for something that no longer existed. "It is not what it seems, is it?" Poirot asked, not turning to the woman, but rather addressing the room as a whole. His tone was light, almost conversational, but the sharpness in his eyes told a different story. The woman flinched, her breath hitching in her throat. "What do you mean?" she managed, her voice trembling. Poirot's gaze drifted back to the rose. "The rose. Mademoiselle, it is not just a symbol of love or tragedy. It is a message, is it not? A symbol of something darker, perhaps." The woman swallowed hard, her eyes darting from Poirot to her husband's body, the crimson stain spreading like a malignant flower. I don't understand. It must have been an accident." Poirot gave a small, almost imperceptible shake of his head. "Accident, you say?" His voice was as smooth as velvet, but beneath it lay the coldness of certainty. "An accident would not leave a thorn like this, a blood-red thorn, to taunt us. It is no accident, mademoiselle. No, this is murder. But the question remains, who is the killer?" The woman stiffened, and her hands began to tremble, her breath coming in shallow gasps. She opened her mouth to speak, but no words came. Poirot had already turned his attention to the other figures in the room, 3 in total, who had stood by silently, their eyes avoiding his gaze. The first was a man of medium build, his eyes darting nervously between Poirot and the body. His dark suit was impeccably tailored, but his hand, clenched at his side, betrayed his unease. He seemed to be the very picture of calm composure, until one looked closer. A faint sheen of perspiration glistened on his brow, and his lips were thin, drawn tight in a strained smile. Poirot moved toward him with a slow, deliberate step. "Monsieur, you are?" "Charles Davies," the man replied quickly, his voice clipped, betraying a hint of impatience. "I was just here to—" "To what, Monsieur Davies?" Poirot interrupted, his tone casual yet pointed. "To pay your respects to the departed, or perhaps to ensure that your own secrets remain hidden." Davies flinched, but his face quickly regained its mask of indifference. "I had nothing to do with this," he muttered, his gaze shifting nervously toward the door. "I don't know what happened here." Poirot studied him closely, his sharp eyes taking in the details others might have missed. The beads of sweat, the tightness in his shoulders, the restless tapping of his fingers against his trousers. There was something in the man's posture, an anxiety that contradicted his words. But Poirot let it lie for now, choosing instead to move on to the next suspect. The second man was older, his graying hair neatly combed, his posture rigid with an air of authority. He had been standing near the window, his back to the rest of the room, as though he had not wanted to be a part of the scene unfolding before him. When he turned to face Poirot, however, the calm mask he wore cracked ever so slightly, revealing a flash of something deeper. Fear? Guilt? It was difficult to say. "Ah, monsieur," Poirot said, his voice a mix of polite curiosity and keen observation. "You are the one who lives here, yes?" The man's jaw tightened. "Yes, I am Jonathan Mallory, the owner of this estate. And you were not expecting to find a dead body in your parlor?" Poirot asked, his gaze never leaving Mallory's face. "I have no idea what happened here," Mallory replied quickly, his voice steady, but Poirot noticed how his hand trembled ever so slightly as he clasped it behind his back. Poirot turned to the final figure in the room, a woman whose beauty seemed to have been marred by the palpable tension that hung in the air. She stood apart from the others, her arms crossed defensively over her chest, her lips pressed into a tight line. Her cold, calculating gaze never wavered from Poirot as he appraised her. "Ah, mademoiselle," Poirot said softly, his tone polite but laced with a subtle challenge. "You are—" "Vivian Mallory," she said sharply, her voice edged with disdain. "My husband is dead, Monsieur Poirot. Do you really need to ask more questions?" Poirot allowed a small smile to curve the corner of his lips. "Ah, but I do need to ask, mademoiselle. I need to ask everyone who might have had a reason to see this man, your husband, dead." He paused, his gaze lingering on her, as if waiting for her to say something more. But she did not. Her expression remained stone-cold, unreadable. Poirot turned back to the body. His eyes narrowed as he observed the blood-stained carpet, the rose with its mocking thorn, the cold, lifeless form of the man who had been, moments ago, so full of life. "You see, mademoiselle," Poirot said, his voice softer now, almost to himself, "it is always the details that betray the truth, and the truth, it always comes to light." The room fell silent once more, the tension thickening, like the storm outside. Poirot stood tall in the midst of it all, his mind already racing through the possibilities, the lies, the secrets. And in that silence, One thing was certain: the blood-red thorn would reveal its secrets soon enough. The storm outside raged on, but within these walls, Hercule Poirot was already hunting for the answers that would expose the killer hiding in plain sight. And when the truth came, it would be as sharp and deadly as the thorn itself. Chapter 2. A silent cry in the garden. The garden was still, its beauty suffocating in its eerie quietness. A gentle mist clung to the earth like a shroud, and the scent of wet roses mixed with the distant smell of decay. The air, thick with the weight of the morning, seemed to hold its breath, as though the very earth had felt the presence of something unnatural. Then came the sound, the softest cry, almost a whisper, but unmistakably a cry of pain. It was brief, a moment of terror that sliced through the stillness like a knife through silk. Hercule Poirot's sharp eyes caught the movement first. There, just beyond the manicured hedge, a figure crouched, hidden from view. He was not the kind of man who would be startled, not the kind of man who would be fooled by the simplicity of a solitary garden and its deceptive tranquility. No, Poirot's mind worked differently. He saw patterns in the chaos, the things others overlooked, and the sudden, nearly imperceptible changes that betrayed the truth. The figure was still, unmoving, as though waiting for something or someone to approach. Poirot's gaze narrowed. His instincts were sharp, honed over countless cases, and his intuition told him that this was no ordinary garden. This was a place where secrets grew like weeds, hidden beneath the surface, nurtured by the quiet but relentless passage of time. He turned to the woman beside him, her face pale and drawn, her expression taut with the weight of an unspoken truth. "Mademoiselle Mallory," Poirot said softly, his voice like velvet, yet cutting through the tension in the air, "tell me, what is it that you see?" Vivienne Mallory's lips parted, but no words came. Her gaze was fixed ahead, her eyes wide with an unreadable emotion. She had led him here after all, to this very garden, to the scene where her husband's body had been discovered just hours ago. And now, it seemed, there was another layer to this mystery, one that had yet to be revealed. It's nothing," she said finally, but her voice trembled. Her hand, tightly clutching a lace handkerchief, shook visibly. Poirot gave a slight nod, his mind working swiftly. "Nothing? Ah, but mademoiselle, there is always something. A mystery, no matter how small, is always a message. And this garden, it is not a place of peace. No, it is a place where truths are buried, hidden beneath the roses and the thorns." Vivienne looked away, as if ashamed of her own words. The silence stretched between them, heavy with unspoken fears. Poirot knew that beneath the facade of decorum there was something more, a deep-seated anxiety, a fear that perhaps she was hiding something, or perhaps she had witnessed something too terrible to speak aloud. Suddenly, a movement caught Poirot's eye. The figure was no longer still. A flash of red, a fluttering of fabric. It was only for a moment, but it was enough. Poirot's sharp mind connected the dots with precision. The momentary flicker of red, the silent cry. A single word played in his mind. Rose. Turning on his heel, Poirot marched forward, his steps swift and determined. The man hidden in the garden had been waiting, and now he would not wait any longer. As he moved closer to the hedge, Poirot's sharp eyes scanned the area with practiced ease. The overgrown ivy, the jagged edges of the stone path, the eerie shadows that stretched unnaturally in the fading light. Every detail was etched into his mind, but it was the rose, that drew his attention. It was a single bloom, too red, too vibrant, sitting on the ground like a discarded token, its petals still dewy, untouched by the time that had passed since the scream had echoed through the garden. He knelt beside it, his fingers brushing gently against the smooth petals, careful not to disturb the surrounding earth. His mind raced with possibilities, each one darker than the last. A cry in the garden, a rose left in the wake of a scream. These were not the signs of a simple accident. No, Poirot knew this for what it was, a carefully constructed puzzle. Vivienne watched him from behind, her face a mask of controlled distress. Poirot felt her gaze, but he did not turn to face her. He was already deep in the mystery, already piecing together the fragments that would soon make up the whole picture. "Tell me, Mademoiselle Mallory," Poirot said softly, his voice calm, but with an edge of command, "who has access to this garden? Who, I wonder, might leave such a mark upon it? Who would dare to leave a message, hidden in plain sight?" Vivienne's lips parted, but no sound emerged. She stepped back, her hands trembling at her sides. Poirot glanced at her once more, noting the change in her demeanor. Her carefully constructed mask had cracked, just enough for him to see the faintest flicker of fear. Who indeed? Poirot mused, his voice barely above a whisper. The rose, so red, so bright. It is no ordinary flower. It is a message, a symbol. It tells a story that only a select few know. But which one of you is the sender? The questions hung in the air like a storm cloud waiting to break, and Poirot could feel the weight of them pressing down on the garden. A storm was indeed coming. He knew that now. And as the first drop of rain fell on the rose's petals, a shiver of unease crawled up his spine. The silent cry had been heard, and the mystery, like the storm, was only just beginning. Vivienne's voice broke the silence, sharp and desperate. "I didn't mean for any of this to happen. It was never supposed to go this far. But now I don't know who to trust anymore." Poirot rose to his feet, turning to face her at last. His eyes were steady, his expression unreadable. "Ah, mademoiselle, you speak of trust, but it is the truth that I seek. And the truth, it is often far darker than the lies we tell ourselves." He stepped away from her, his gaze sweeping over the garden once more. The rose glistened in the rain, its crimson petals stained with something far more dangerous than mere water. A red herring? Perhaps, but Poirot knew better than to let his assumptions cloud his judgment. The suspects were clear: Mallory, Vivienne, and the man lurking in the shadows of the garden. But which one of them, he wondered, was hiding the darkest secret? Each one seemed to have something to gain from the murder. Each one carried a motive that begged to be explored. Poirot's sharp eyes darted around the garden once more. Every inch of it held a clue, every corner a shadow that could reveal the truth. But in that moment, he realized something else, something far more disturbing. The figure in the garden was not the only one hiding in the shadows. No, there were others who watched and waited. And soon, their time would come. As Poirot turned to face Vivienne, he could see the weariness in her eyes. She was on the edge, and soon the truth would spill out of her like a broken dam. But for now, he would wait. The rose would reveal more than its thorn, and when it did, the storm would finally break. "Rest assured, mademoiselle," Poirot said, his voice low and calm, "we will uncover the truth. The silent cry in the garden will not remain silent for long." And with that, the garden fell quiet once more. the storm closing in around them. The answer, Poirot knew, was just beyond reach, but soon it would be his to claim. Chapter 3: The Secret Beneath the Petals. The rose lay delicately upon the stone path, its once pristine petals now beginning to curl, its crimson hue darkening, as if the flower itself were mourning its own fate. A single drop of dew, heavy and perfect, clung to the petal, almost as if frozen in time. And there, beneath the soft curve of the petal, was something that did not belong. It was a flash of something metallic, a glint that caught the fading sunlight, a tiny reflection that screamed out for attention. Poirot's sharp eyes were already trained on it, his steps silent as he approached. There, tucked away beneath the soft folds of the flower, was a small silver locket, its surface tarnished with age, but still unmistakably out of place in the lush garden. He picked it up carefully, examining it as if the very act of touching it might yield some critical clue. A locket. Why was it hidden beneath a rose? Poirot's mind raced with the possibilities. A clue for him, or perhaps for someone else. His lips curled into a small, almost imperceptible smile. But it was the small things, the details, that often spoke the loudest. "Mademoiselle," Poirot said without turning, his voice steady, but with a hint of command. "This locket, it belongs to someone, non? But to whom, I wonder?" Vivienne Mallory stood a few paces behind him, her face pale as she looked at the item in Poirot's hand. I don't know," she said softly, her voice trembling. "I don't recall seeing it before." Poirot did not respond immediately. Instead, he held the locket in the light, watching as the rain began to drizzle again, the droplets tracing lines across the surface of the silver. A soft click came from the locket as he gently pried it open, revealing a small, faded photograph inside. The image was a portrait of a young woman, dark-haired, with eyes that seemed to burn with a secret, and a smile that hinted at something much darker beneath the surface. The photo was old, the edges curled and worn, but it was unmistakable. Poirot's brow furrowed slightly. The woman in the picture looked familiar. He had seen her somewhere before. Where? His mind raced, connecting dots that had not yet fully aligned. "I must ask you, Mademoiselle Mallory," Poirot continued, closing the locket with a soft snap, his voice growing firmer. "Do you know of anyone who might have left this behind? A lover, perhaps, or a companion from your past?" Vivienne's gaze fell to the ground, her hands trembling by her sides. "I don't know," she said again, her words distant, as if she were lost in a memory she could not quite reach. "It could belong to anyone." "Anyone," Poirot echoed, his voice laced with quiet skepticism. But I believe it is more than just anyone, mademoiselle. For you see, I believe this locket belongs to someone who was very close to your husband." He glanced over his shoulder, his eyes narrowing. "Someone who knew your husband far more intimately than you might care to admit." Vivienne's eyes widened, her breath catching in her throat. "What are you implying?" Her voice was sharp, a flicker of panic in her eyes. "This is ridiculous." Poirot's gaze remained steady, unflinching. "I am implying nothing. I am only seeking the truth. And the truth, as always, has a way of revealing itself, whether we are ready for it or not." He turned back to the rose, his fingers brushing against the edges of the petals. Once more, "Tell me, mademoiselle, how long have you known your husband?" Vivienne hesitated. Her eyes darted to the locket in Poirot's hand and then back to him. "For years. We were childhood friends before we became married." "I see," Poirot murmured, his mind processing the information with meticulous precision. "And how would you describe your relationship? Was it a happy one?" Her lips parted as if to speak, but then closed again, her eyes filled with something unreadable. After a long pause, she said, "Yes, of course. We were happy." Poirot nodded slowly. "And yet, mademoiselle, it appears that this garden holds more secrets than you might care to acknowledge." He placed the locket back in his pocket and rose, his eyes scanning the surroundings with practiced ease. His gaze flicked from the garden to the distant house, the open windows, and the shadows that lingered in every corner of the estate. "Tell me, mademoiselle, who else has access to this garden? Who else might be hiding something here?" She stepped back, her breath shallow, her hands trembling. I don't know. No one but the staff, and—" She trailed off, her eyes narrowing, as if trying to piece together a memory that eluded her. Poirot's eyes narrowed in turn. "And yet there is something you are not telling me, n'est-ce pas? Some detail you are withholding, a piece of the puzzle that you refuse to see." Vivienne looked away, her lips pressed together, tightly. "I don't know what you mean." "But of course you do," Poirot said, his tone gentle, but with an unmistakable edge. "You see, mademoiselle, this locket is not just a keepsake. It is a key to a secret that has been buried for far too long. And that secret, I believe, lies beneath the petals of the rose." As he spoke, Poirot's mind turned over the clues, his thoughts like a well-oiled machine, clicking into place. The rose, the locket, the photograph, the garden itself, an oasis of beauty, but one that concealed far darker truths beneath its surface. There was a lie here, buried deep within the soil of this estate, waiting to be uncovered. "Let us not forget," Poirot continued, his voice calm, "that roses, while beautiful, can also wound. The thorns are sharp. They pierce the skin. And I suspect, mademoiselle, that it is not the rose that is hiding the truth, but rather the person who placed it there." Vivienne stiffened. "I don't know what you're trying to say." Poirot's gaze lingered on her for a moment longer. "What I am saying, Mademoiselle Mallory, is that your husband's death is no accident. It is a carefully calculated act, and those who believe themselves free of suspicion are the ones who must be watched most closely." The rain began to fall harder, the sound of it growing louder as it struck the ground, drenching the petals of the rose, washing away the last traces of the truth beneath its surface. The storm was coming, both in the heavens above and in the secrets that would soon rise from the earth. Poirot stood tall, his face unreadable, as he glanced once more at the locket, at the rose, and at the woman who stood before him, hiding more than she could bear. The garden, beautiful though it was, had been stained by death, and Poirot knew, deep in his gut, that this was only the beginning. "Ah, but the secrets beneath the petals," Poirot whispered to himself, "they never remain hidden for long." And, as the storm raged around them, Poirot's mind swirled with the thoughts of what lay ahead, of the truth he was determined to find, no matter how deeply it was buried. Chapter 4. The Unseen Hand That Strikes. The sound of the clock chimed, its deep toll vibrating through the dimly lit drawing room. The air was thick with the scent of roses, too sweet, almost sickly, clinging to the very walls. But it was the silence that unsettled the room, a kind of quiet that felt unnatural, as though the house itself was holding its breath. A figure stood in the doorway, her eyes wide, her hands trembling, as she clutched a folded letter in her hands. I don't understand, Vivian Mallory whispered, her voice shaking, the words barely audible. She stood frozen, her face pale as she stared at the room. It was as though she had seen something in the shadows, something that did not belong. It was just here, I swear. It was just here. Poirot's sharp eyes flicked to the letter in her hands, the tremor in her fingers betraying the quiet panic she sought to hide. His gaze lingered on her for a moment longer than necessary. He had been trained to read people, every shift in posture, every small detail, every fleeting glance. And in Vivian Mallory, he saw more than a woman on the edge of distress. He saw someone hiding something, someone who had not yet revealed the full story. "Ah, Mademoiselle Mallory," Poirot began softly, his voice precise, calming. "You have seen something, yes? Something you did not wish to see." Vivian looked up at him, her eyes wide with panic. I don't know what you mean." Poirot's gaze never wavered. "You hold the truth in your hand, yet you are unwilling to let it go." He stepped closer, his movements as deliberate and quiet as a predator stalking its prey. "Tell me, mademoiselle, what has changed in this room? What has happened since last we spoke?" Her lips parted, but the words caught in her throat, choked by fear or something darker. She shook her head slightly, as if to deny the truth before it was spoken aloud. But Poirot had already deduced the answer. The room had changed. The atmosphere had shifted, and the letter, she had not even touched it until now. Vivian slowly unfolded the letter, her fingers trembling as the paper cracked with age. The contents were simple, the handwriting precise, but hurried, almost as though it had been written under duress. Poirot glanced at it over her shoulder. The words were chilling in their simplicity. "The unseen hand has struck, and your fate is sealed." A deep silence fell over the room, the weight of the words pressing down on them all. Vivian's eyes filled with terror, the blood draining from her face. The letter had been delivered just minutes ago, its arrival as sudden as the violence it foretold. "Who wrote this?" Poirot asked softly, his voice an unsettling calm. "Who is trying to manipulate you, mademoiselle?" Vivian opened her mouth, but could not speak, her eyes darting to the door, as though hoping someone might enter and provide an explanation. Poirot's gaze followed hers, noting the way her body stiffened, as if bracing for someone, to appear. A moment later, the door creaked open. Charles Davies stepped into the room, his face betraying little of the inner turmoil that Poirot had begun to suspect was bubbling just beneath the surface. He was a man of wealth, with a smooth, polished exterior that masked his true nature. But Poirot had already seen through the facade. "Mademoiselle Mallory, is everything all right?" Davies asked, his voice betraying just a hint of anxiety. Vivian stiffened at the sound of his voice, her gaze lingering on him for a fraction of a second too long. "It's nothing, Charles," she said quickly, her voice rising in pitch. "Just a letter, that's all." Davies took a step closer, his eyes flicking to the letter in her hands. "A letter? From whom?" he asked, his voice strained, but careful. Poirot's sharp eyes moved between the two, his mind turning over the new piece of information with deliberate precision. Davies' unease was palpable. He had not expected to see the letter, had not expected to be caught in the middle of this web of secrets. Poirot knew then. This was no mere coincidence. The letter, like everything else, was part of the intricate puzzle they were unraveling. Mademoiselle, I must ask you to tell me the truth, Poirot said, his voice quiet but insistent. Who wrote this letter? Was it one of the servants? One of your husband's associates? Vivienne shook her head, her hands shaking uncontrollably now. I don't know, she whispered. I don't know who it could be. Poirot's gaze shifted back to Davies. And you, Monsieur Davies, do you know who might have written such a letter? Surely you must have some idea. Davies paused for just a moment too long, his gaze dropping to the floor as he shifted uneasily. His hand brushed against the side of his coat, and Poirot's sharp eyes caught the subtle movement. Davies was hiding something. He was trying to keep his hands from shaking. Poirot's mind raced, dissecting every tiny detail, every action, every word that had been spoken. Perhaps Mademoiselle Mallory is overreacting, Davies said smoothly, though his words rang hollow. After all, there's no reason to believe this letter is anything more than a prank. A prank? Poirot's voice was low, almost menacing in its quiet intensity. A prank, monsieur? The fate of a person's life is not something to be taken lightly, is it? Vivienne opened her mouth to speak, but before she could, a loud crash interrupted her. The sound came from the hallway just outside, followed by the hurried footsteps of someone running away. Poirot's sharp eyes darted toward the door. Stay here, he said, his voice firm, as he stepped forward. He paused just long enough to make eye contact with both of them, ensuring they understood the gravity of the situation. I shall return shortly. Poirot moved quickly, his steps echoing through the halls as he followed the sounds of the retreating figure. He rounded the corner of the hallway and found nothing but an empty room. The window was open, a breeze rushing in, scattering the curtains like the wings of a bird startled into flight. He turned his gaze back to the ground. There, near the edge of the rug, was a single, discarded black glove. Poirot knelt down, inspecting it carefully. The leather was expensive, of a fine make, but there was something more, something that would make it stand out. Poirot lifted the glove to his nose, inhaling the faint scent of tobacco. A person of wealth, then. Someone who could afford fine gloves, someone who moved through this house with a sense of ownership. Poirot's mind clicked into place, the final piece falling into view. He stood up, his heart racing with the excitement of discovery. His eyes turned back toward the letter. The unseen hand had struck, and it was only a matter of time before the hand revealed itself. The events were unfolding quickly now, too quickly to ignore. As Poirot re-entered the room, he saw Vivienne and Davies standing close together, the tension between them thick enough to cut with a knife. Poirot's sharp gaze settled on them, and with it, a realization hit him. A devastating truth, one that would rock the very foundation of the case. Monsieur Davies, Poirot said softly, his voice calm but firm, it was you, was it not? You are the one who left the glove behind. And you, Mademoiselle Mallory, you knew the truth all along. The silence in the room was deafening, and in that moment, Poirot knew the game had changed. The unseen hand had struck again, but this time it was no longer invisible. Ah, Poirot mused, his voice quiet but certain, the hand that strikes in the dark. It is never as unseen as we believe. And now, the truth is finally out. With those words, Poirot's mind, always so calculating, took the final step toward the revelation. He had the pieces, the clues, the motives, and now it was time to lay them bare for all to see. The truth would not remain hidden. for much longer. Chapter 5. A Deadly Blossom in Bloom. The heavy scent of roses filled the air, thick and suffocating, as if the garden itself were wrapped in a veil of impending doom. The petals, once vibrant and full of life, now seemed to curl inward, as if recoiling from something unseen, something that had tainted them beyond recognition. Hercule Poirot stood at the threshold of the garden, his sharp eyes scanning the scene with an intensity that would have unsettled even the most seasoned of detectives. His gaze fell upon the lone rose in the center of the bed, a blood-red blossom, its color so deep it seemed to bleed into the earth itself. It was the first thing that struck him as wrong. Ah, but what a striking image it presented. A deadly blossom in bloom, its beauty betraying its poisonous nature. How many had been deceived by beauty before? How many had been drawn in by the allure of something that seemed so perfect, only to find themselves ensnared by its thorns? Poirot's mind raced with the implications of this single rose, so beautiful, yet so dangerously out of place. A soft rustle behind him broke his reverie. He turned, his eyes narrowing as he saw Vivienne Mallory approaching. Her face was drawn, her lips pale, but she carried herself with an air of something more, something she was trying desperately to hide. Her hands were clenched at her sides, and her eyes, darting around the garden, were filled with something that Poirot could not quite decipher. Was it fear, guilt, or was it a far more complex emotion, one that only the most careful observer could truly understand? "Mademoiselle Mallory," Poirot said, his voice a soft, unyielding whisper. "You have come to join me, then? To see the flower, perhaps, the one that blooms with the scent of death?" Vivienne flinched at his words, her breath hitching in her throat. I don't know what you mean," she stammered, her voice wavering. Poirot did not respond immediately. He took a slow, deliberate step forward, his gaze fixed on the rose, his fingers twitching with the need to examine it, to understand its secret. "The rose," he said almost to himself, "it is a symbol of beauty, is it not? And yet what is beauty, mademoiselle? Is it not also a mask that hides a far darker truth?" Vivienne shifted uncomfortably, her gaze shifting between Poirot and the flower. She swallowed, her throat dry. I don't understand. What are you trying to say?" Poirot's eyes locked onto hers, his expression unreadable. "I am saying, mademoiselle, that the rose you see before you is not just a simple flower. No, it is a deadly blossom in bloom, one that has been carefully cultivated, a flower that holds the truth of what has happened here." He stepped closer to the rose, his hands moving in precise, practiced gestures. He ran his fingers lightly over the petals, examining the edges, the veins running through them. The rose was perfect, in a way, but that perfection was what troubled him. It was too perfect, too deliberate. "The petals, mademoiselle," Poirot continued, his voice smooth, "are immaculate, but notice how they curl inward, as though hiding something. It is as though they are protecting a secret buried deep within their core." Vivienne shifted uncomfortably once more, her eyes flicking nervously around the garden. I don't know what you mean. I don't think there's anything here." "Ah, but there is," Poirot interrupted, his tone sharp. "You see, mademoiselle, the rose is a clue. And just like this garden, just like this house, it has been carefully designed to conceal the truth." He paused, allowing his words to hang in the air, heavy with the weight of his deduction. Whoever planted this flower, whoever cultivated it, they intended it to bloom at precisely this moment. They knew what it would reveal. Vivienne took a step back, her hands trembling, What are you saying? Her voice was almost a whisper, her words trembling in the space between them. Who would do something like that? Poirot's eyes were steady, unwavering. Someone with a great deal to gain, mademoiselle. Someone who understood that a deadly blossom, once in bloom, could create a chain of events that would be impossible to reverse. Before Vivian could respond, the sound of footsteps echoed in the distance. Charles Davies emerged from the shadows of the garden, his figure appearing as though he had been watching them for some time. His face, though carefully neutral, betrayed a certain tension in his posture, a tightness in his shoulders that Poirot noted instantly. "Ah, Monsieur Davy," Poirot said, his voice smooth, but with an edge of something more cutting. "You have come to join us, I see. How interesting. I must say, this garden holds many secrets, does it not?" Davies hesitated, his eyes flicking to Vivienne, then to Poirot. I was just checking on the roses," he said, his voice tinged with uncertainty. "We've had some trouble with pests lately. I thought it might be best to inspect them." Poirot raised an eyebrow. "Pests, monsieur?" A curious choice of words. "Pests, indeed." He paused, allowing the silence to stretch between them. "But it is not the pests I am concerned with, is it? No, it is something far more dangerous that blooms here." Davy's jaw tightened, his eyes narrowing just a fraction. "What are you implying, Poirot?" Poirot allowed himself a small, knowing smile. "I am implying, Monsieur Davies, that there are far more dangerous things in this garden than insects. There are motives hidden beneath the surface, things that grow and fester in the shadows until they are ready to bloom, just like this rose." The tension in the air thickened as Poirot's words sank in. Vivienne glanced between the two men, her face pale, her lips parted as though she wanted to speak but could find no words. Davies, for his part, seemed unruffled, but the flicker of something in his eyes betrayed his discomfort. Poirot turned his attention back to the rose. "Do you see it, mademoiselle? The perfection of this bloom, how it hides the truth beneath its petals, the way it has been cultivated to deceive." Vivian swallowed hard, her hands still trembling. I don't know what you mean." Poirot's gaze never wavered as he fixed her with a pointed stare. "Ah, but that is the problem, mademoiselle. You don't know, do you? You don't know what is hiding in plain sight. Just like the rose, you have allowed yourself to be deceived by what is beautiful, by what seems harmless. But underneath it all, there is something far darker, something far more deadly." Vivienne's lips parted, as though she were about to say something, but no words came. The silence stretched between them, thick and heavy, like the impending storm in the sky above. Poirot's mind was already racing, piecing together the clues as they fell into place. The letter, the rose, the tension between Vivienne and Davies, all of it pointed to something far more sinister. This was no simple murder. No, this was a carefully orchestrated plot, one that had been planned for months, maybe even years. And now, it was finally coming to fruition. "The rose," Poirot said softly, almost to himself, "is but the beginning. It is the first step in a plan that has been years in the making, and the person behind it knows exactly how to pull the strings." Vivienne looked at him, her eyes filled with a mixture of fear and disbelief. "No, you're wrong. This can't be true." Poirot turned to her, his gaze soft but firm. "Mademoiselle Mallory, you have been deceived, but you are not the only one. There are others here, others who seek to manipulate you, to use you as a pawn in their game, and soon you will see the truth for yourself." With those final words, the atmosphere in the garden shifted, as if the very air around them had thickened. The storm clouds gathered overhead, and the tension in the room, in the garden, reached a fever pitch. The deadly blossom had bloomed, and now the truth was beginning to unfurl, slowly but surely. Poirot stepped away from the rose, his mind still working, his thoughts still racing. He knew the truth was close, that the final pieces were just within his grasp. But even as he reached for them, he knew one thing for certain. The game was far from over. The deadly blossom had bloomed, but now it was time for the real story to unfold. And in the end, Poirot would make sure that the truth, no matter how dark or dangerous, would be revealed. Chapter 6. The Poisoned Stem. The thunder cracked across the sky with a violence that seemed to shake the very foundations of the house. The windows rattled as the storm's fury descended, its wind howling against the walls. Inside, the air was heavy with the scent of damp wood and the faint, unsettling fragrance of roses that filled the drawing room. But it was the silence that unsettled Poirot most, the silence that followed the deafening sound of the storm outside. Vivienne Mallory stood by the window, her face pressed against the glass, her gaze distant, lost in the chaos of the storm. Her hands, pale and delicate, were clenched tightly around the edge of the curtain. She did not speak. She did not move. Poirot's sharp eyes studied her from across the room, his mind working as always, piecing together the fragments of this tangled web. She was a woman on the edge, trapped by her own emotions, her own secrets. And yet, as much as she tried to hide it, Poirot could see the truth behind her mask. He took a slow step forward, his polished shoes making no sound on the creaky wooden floor. His voice broke the silence, soft yet firm, as though slicing through the thick tension that enveloped them both. "Mademoiselle Mallory," he said, his words deliberate, "tell me, what is it that you are so afraid of?" She flinched at the sound of his voice, her shoulders trembling slightly. Without turning to face him, she replied, her voice barely a whisper, "Nothing. There's nothing to be afraid of." Poirot allowed a small, knowing smile to tug at the corner of his lips. "Ah, but you see, mademoiselle, I do not believe that is true. There is something beneath the surface, something you are not telling me." He paused, his gaze never leaving her. "It is in your eyes, the fear that lingers just beneath the surface, the way your hands tremble. You are hiding something, mademoiselle, and it is time for that secret to come to light." Vivienne remained silent, her hands still clutching the curtain, her knuckles white. Her breath came in shallow gasps, and for a moment, Poirot thought he saw a flicker of something, a brief, unguarded moment, before she turned her face away, hiding the emotion that threatened to spill out. Poirot's attention shifted, as if instinctively drawn to the table nearby. There, half hidden beneath a pile of documents, lay a single rose, its stem still moist with water, its petals an unnatural shade of deep red. It was beautiful, yes, but something about it struck him as wrong. It was the kind of flower that bloomed too perfectly, too deliberately, as though it had been cultivated for a purpose he had yet to understand. He moved toward the table, his steps measured and precise, his eyes never leaving the flower. As he reached for the stem, he noticed something odd, a faint discoloration on the tip of the rose's stem. The color was subtle, barely noticeable, but Poirot's sharp eyes caught it immediately. It was almost as though the stem had been soaked in something that had tainted the otherwise perfect flower. A moment later, Vivian's voice broke the stillness once again, this time tinged with a note of panic. "No, don't touch it," she cried, her voice cracking. "Please don't touch the rose." Poirot turned to her slowly, his eyes narrowing slightly. There it was again, the fear raw and unmasked in her voice, the kind of fear that came when someone was hiding a truth too dark to admit. He placed the rose carefully back on the table, his mind racing. "Why do you not want me to touch it, mademoiselle?" he asked, his tone calm, measured. "What is it about this rose that you fear?" Vivian hesitated, her eyes darting to the flower and then back to Poirot. She swallowed, her throat dry. I can't explain it," she murmured. It's just not right. There's something wrong with it." Poirot studied her for a moment, his sharp mind calculating, analyzing every nuance of her reaction. It was clear to him now. Vivian Mallory was hiding something crucial, and this rose was at the heart of it. He could sense it, feel it in the air, like a subtle shift in the atmosphere. This rose was not just a flower. It was a symbol, a marker of something far more dangerous. "I see," Poirot said, his voice low, almost gentle. "You fear what it represents. But, mademoiselle, it is not the rose that is dangerous. It is what lies beneath it." He stepped closer, his gaze unwavering. "Tell me, mademoiselle, did you know that the stem has been poisoned?" Her face went pale at the words. She took a step back, her eyes wide with shock. "Poisoned," she whispered, as if the word itself were too much to bear. Poirot nodded slowly, his eyes never leaving hers. "Yes, poisoned. And I believe it was not an accident. Someone wanted this flower to be the vessel for something far more sinister. They wanted it to reach you, to speak to you in a language only you would understand." Vivian's hands shook as she pressed them to her face, her breath coming in short, erratic gasps. "No," she said, her voice trembling. "No, that can't be true. This is impossible. You're wrong." Poirot took a step back, his mind working furiously, piecing together the puzzle. "Impossible? Ah, but you see, mademoiselle, there is nothing impossible in this world of ours, only things we have yet to understand." He paused, his eyes flicking to the rose again. "This flower, this poisoned stem, it is a message, mademoiselle, a warning." Vivian turned away from him, her hands gripping the back of a chair, as if she were trying to steady herself. "I don't want to hear it," she whispered, her voice raw. "I don't want to know." Poirot watched her for a moment longer, his expression thoughtful. "But you already know, mademoiselle. You have known all along. You see, the poison in the stem is not just a physical danger. No, it is something far more insidious. It is a symbol of trust betrayed, of secrets buried too deeply to remain hidden." He turned back to the table, his fingers lightly brushing the petals of the rose once more. "Who would want to poison you, mademoiselle? Who would go to such lengths to ensure that this flower reaches you, that you are the one who must bear its mark?" Vivian's lips trembled, but she remained silent. Poirot's gaze shifted from her to the window, his mind working swiftly, the pieces falling into place. There was a web here, a network of lies and deceit, and at the center of it all stood Vivian Mallory, caught in a trap she could not escape. But there was one thing that Poirot knew for certain. The poison in the stem had not come from any mere accident. No, someone had planned this with careful deliberation, ensuring that the rose would bloom at precisely the right moment, carrying with it the deadly mark of betrayal. And soon, Poirot would uncover the hand behind it all. The storm outside raged on, the thunder crashing in the distance, like the final act of a tragedy, and in that moment, Poirot knew the truth was closing in on him. The poisoned stem was just the beginning. The real question was, who among them would be the next to fall prey to the web of lies that had been so carefully woven? "Ah, but the poison is not just in the stem, mademoiselle," Poirot whispered, his voice like velvet. "It is in the heart of this mystery, waiting to reveal its final, deadly truth." Chapter 7. The Whisper of a Dying Rose. The room was heavy, with the scent of damp earth and decaying petals. The faint flicker of candlelight cast long, trembling shadows against the walls, as though the very air itself was alive with secrets. Poirot stood in the center of the room, his hands folded behind his back, his eyes sharp and unblinking as he studied the scene before him. On the small table in the center, a single rose lay in a shallow vase, its once vibrant red petals now curling and fading into shades of brown, like something that had been forgotten, left to wither. The rose was dying, but it was the whisper of its death that piqued Poirot's interest. It wasn't the fragrance that lingered in the room. It was something darker, more sinister, something that echoed the decay of the truth itself. "Monsieur Poirot, do you not think it's strange?" came a voice from the doorway, breaking the silence. Vivian Mallory stepped into the room, her face pale and drawn, her eyes shadowed by the weight of her thoughts. That this rose should be here, in this room, at this moment? Poirot turned toward her, his sharp eyes studying her with the precision of a hawk. "Strange? Ah, mademoiselle, strange is the way in which human nature reveals itself when it is under pressure." His voice was soft, measured, but his gaze never wavered from hers. "And I believe, mademoiselle, that it is not the rose that is strange. No, it is the reason it has been placed here at this moment that puzzles me." Vivienne stiffened slightly at his words, her gaze flicking to the rose before returning to him. "You think this rose means something more than just a dying flower?" Her voice trembled, and for a fleeting moment, Poirot saw a flicker of something in her eyes. Fear, guilt, or perhaps a mixture of both. Poirot's lips curled into a small, knowing smile. "I believe, mademoiselle, that the rose is not merely dying. It is speaking, if you will listen. It is the whisper of something lost, something hidden beneath layers of time, perhaps of grief, perhaps of lies." Vivian looked at the flower again, her eyes distant, haunted. I don't understand. Why do you think it's so important?" Poirot walked slowly toward the table, his fingers hovering just above the petals of the rose. "You see, mademoiselle, it is not the rose itself, but its placement. A single rose, placed here, in this room. There are no other flowers like it in the house, no other roses, no other colors, just this one. The question is, why? Why this rose? Why now?" Vivienne swallowed hard, her lips pressed together. "I don't know. It's just a flower." "A flower, yes," Poirot said, his voice quiet but insistent. "But the timing is what troubles me. The poison, the death of your husband, and now this rose. They are all connected, mademoiselle, whether you wish to admit it or not." Vivian's hands trembled, and she stepped back as if the words themselves were too much to bear. "I told you, I didn't know what was happening. I didn't know that he would—" "You knew," Poirot interrupted, his tone gentle, but firm. "Perhaps not consciously, but you knew. You have always known, more than you admit. You've known about the lies, the deceit, the darkness that surrounded you. And now, this rose, it is the last symbol of the game that has been played for so long. The game that you've been a part of." Vivienne's breath hitched, and her hands clasped together tightly in front of her, as if trying to hold herself together. I didn't do anything," she whispered. Poirot's gaze softened, just for a moment, as he studied her. "No, mademoiselle, I do not believe you did anything, but I do believe you are the key. You are the one who holds the answers, whether you are ready to admit it or not." The door to the room creaked open, and Charles Davies stepped inside, his face shadowed by the dim candlelight. His presence was like a weight in the room, a subtle pressure that seemed to make the air even heavier. He looked at Vivienne, then at Poirot, his eyes narrowing slightly. "Is something wrong, Poirot?" he asked, his voice smooth, too smooth. "It seems that you're examining that rose as though it were a murder weapon." Poirot's sharp eyes flicked to Davies, studying him with a cool detachment. "Ah, Monsieur Davies, always so quick to dismiss what you do, not wish to acknowledge. But I am afraid that the rose is only the beginning. The real weapon is something far more subtle, something that has been lurking in the shadows all along." Davies' lips pressed into a thin line, but he did not speak. Instead, his eyes darted toward Vivienne, then back to Poirot. There was something in the way he moved, a rigidity in his posture that betrayed his unease. Poirot stepped closer to him, his gaze unwavering. "You have something to hide, monsieur. Davies, you always have. You are the one who planted the rose, aren't you?" Davies stiffened, his eyes momentarily flickering with a flash of panic, but he quickly regained his composure, giving a tight smile. "I don't know what you're talking about, Poirot. I simply came in to check on Vivienne." "Check on her?" Poirot repeated, his voice low and calm, but with a sharp edge that cut through the tension. "Ah, but monsieur, you have been checking on more than Mademoiselle Mallory. You have been checking on your own involvement in this game. You who planted the seed of deceit in her heart. You who have played your part in this tragedy, manipulating her and everyone around you." Vivienne's face paled, and she looked from Poirot to Davies, her eyes wide with confusion and fear. "Charles, is that true?" she whispered. Davies hesitated for a moment longer than was natural, and in that moment, Poirot saw the truth written across his face. It was the smallest of changes, a subtle twitch, the narrowing of his eyes, the stiffening of his jaw. But Poirot saw it clearly. Davies was guilty. He had been behind everything. The lies, the manipulation, the death of her husband. "Monsieur Davies," Poirot said softly, his voice dropping to a whisper, "you do not fool me. You are the one who pulled the strings all along. And now the last act is unfolding, and you will not escape it." The room seemed to fall silent, as though the very air had drawn in a deep, collective breath. Davies looked at Poirot, his expression a mixture of frustration and fear, before he finally spoke, his voice barely above a whisper. "You don't understand," he said, his tone tight with barely controlled anger. "You think you know everything, but you don't. You have no idea what you're dealing with." Poirot's eyes flashed with the brilliance of someone who had already seen the truth long before anyone else. "Ah, but I do, monsieur. I know exactly what I am dealing with." His gaze moved from Davies to Vivian, and then to the dying rose on the table. This rose, this poisoned stem, has been the signal, the warning that this game was coming to its end. And now, monsieur, you are the one who will bear the consequences. The silence in the room thickened, and for a moment, Poirot's voice was the only sound that seemed to matter. The whisper of a dying rose is not just the fading of a flower, Monsieur Davy. It is the sound of the truth, finally revealing itself. Vivian stood frozen, her eyes wide with disbelief, as the weight of the revelation sank in. The storm outside raged on, but inside, the storm of truth had already broken. "Ah," Poirot murmured softly, "the petals fall, but the thorns remain, and they will pierce the guilty heart, as they always do." With those final words, Poirot turned his gaze toward the door, his mind already moving on to the next phase of the investigation. The truth had come to light, and now the final chapter of this deadly tale would be written. Chapter 8. The Broken Vow of a Gardener. The storm had finally passed, but the heavy air lingered, thick with the scent of wet earth and the faintest trace of something bitter, almost metallic. Poirot stood at the edge of the garden, his gaze sweeping over the tangled mess of flowers and hedges that stretched before him. The garden was in disarray, as if someone had once cared for it, and then, without warning, abandoned it to the forces of neglect. Yet, beneath the wildness, there was something deliberate about its chaos, a pattern that only Poirot could see. A single, broken branch lay on the ground, a flower crushed beneath it. The bloom was a rose, red, but dull now, its petals bruised and torn. Poirot bent down, his fingers gently brushing the ruined petals. There was something haunting about the flower, a memory of something once cherished, now discarded, its beauty marred by the weight of violence. He rose slowly, his mind racing, as he turned to face the man. Standing behind him, the gardener, a lanky figure in his mid-50s, stood with his hands clasped in front of him, his eyes downcast. He was dressed in worn clothes, a faded brown coat that seemed to have absorbed every drop of rain the storm had cast upon it. But it wasn't the man's appearance that struck Poirot. It was the air of guilt that clung to him like a second skin. "Ah, Monsieur Laurent," Poirot said, his voice soft but precise. "You have worked here, I believe, for many years." The gardener shifted, his lips parting as though to speak, but no words came. His eyes darted to the ruined rose, then back to Poirot. "Yes," he finally said, his voice rough, almost as though it had been unused for some time. "Many years. I tend to the garden, monsieur. It's all I know." Poirot's gaze narrowed slightly. "You tend to the garden, yes. But I wonder, Monsieur Laurent, do you tend to it as carefully as you should? Or has something changed? Something that, perhaps, even you could not control?" Laurent shifted again, his gaze flicking nervously between Poirot and the flower. "I do my best," he muttered, his voice low. "I always have." Poirot took a step closer, his gaze never leaving Laurent's face. "But you see, monsieur, I believe your best was not enough. I believe that something has broken. Something far more important than just the garden." His eyes dropped once more to the rose, its lifeless petals scattered on the ground. "A vow, perhaps, a vow you made to someone long ago, a vow that has since been broken." Laurent stiffened, and for a moment Poirot thought he saw a flicker of panic in his eyes. I don't know what you mean," he said, his voice rising just slightly in pitch. Poirot's lips parted in a small smile, the kind that never reached his eyes. Ah, but you do, monsieur. You know exactly what I mean. You made a promise, a vow, to someone who trusted you, someone who, I believe, is no longer with us, and now that vow has been broken. Laurent's hands clenched into fists, and for a moment Poirot could see the strain of control it took for the man to keep from lashing out. His face reddened, and he took a step back. "I didn't mean for it to happen. I swear, I didn't mean for it to happen," he whispered, his voice thick with emotion. Poirot allowed the silence to stretch between them, his mind working furiously. There was something deeply unsettling about Laurent's behavior, something in the way he spoke, the way his eyes avoided Poirot's, the way his body tensed every time the conversation veered toward the truth. Laurent was hiding something, something far more dangerous than the state of the garden. "You speak of intentions, Monsieur Laurent," Poirot said, his voice calm, almost coaxing. "But intentions are not what I seek. I seek the truth that lies hidden beneath these flowers, beneath these thorns. What is it that you have hidden, Monsieur Laurent? What is it that you have kept from us all?" Laurent's breath hitched, and for a moment it seemed as though he might collapse, his body giving way to the weight of whatever burden he carried. He turned his back to Poirot, taking a few unsteady steps toward the garden's edge. "I never meant for it to go this far. I just wanted to help. I thought I was doing the right thing." Poirot watched him closely, his mind turning over the clues like a well-worn puzzle. The gardener's words, his hesitation, they were pieces of a larger story, one that he was only beginning to unravel. "Help, Monsieur Laurent? Who are you helping? And why does it seem that your help has come at such a high price?" Laurent spun around, his face pale and drawn. His eyes were wide, almost frantic. "You don't understand. You don't know what it's like to be under that kind of pressure, to be asked to do things you don't want to do, to promise things you never intended, to keep. I was just trying to make things right, to fix what I had broken." Poirot stepped closer, his gaze fixed on Laurent's face. "What had you broken, monsieur? And whom had you promised to fix it for?" Laurent's eyes shifted to the flower bed, his shoulders sagging in defeat. His voice dropped to a mere whisper. "It was for her, for Miss Vivian. She asked me to help her husband. I didn't want to, but I couldn't say no. She said it was the only way to stop the pain." Poirot's mind raced, his thoughts aligning with clarity. Vivian Mallory, the woman at the center of this tangled web, was connected to the gardener, just as he had suspected. The clues were beginning to form a pattern, one that revealed a deeper, darker secret than he had first anticipated. "Miss Vivienne?" Poirot asked, his voice laced with both curiosity and caution. "And what exactly did she ask you to do, Monsieur Laurent?" Laurent closed his eyes, as though the memory itself were too painful to bear. She said her husband was dying, slowly, that he had been poisoned, but he didn't know it. She said she needed me to help him, to end it, to make it quick, before it got worse. Poirot felt the weight of Laurent's words settle in the room like an oppressive fog. The murder of Vivienne's husband. It was not just a crime of passion or revenge. It had been a planned, methodical act, carried out under the guise of mercy. Poisoned stem, a broken vow, a gardener trying to redeem himself by carrying out the wishes of a desperate woman. "But you did not just end it, did you, monsieur?" Poirot said softly, his voice cutting through the tension like a knife. "No, You did not merely end the man's suffering. You took something from him, his life, and in doing so, you broke a vow, one that I believe was never meant to be kept. Laurent's face contorted with shame, and he fell to his knees in front of Poirot, his hands clutching the dirt beneath him. I thought I could fix it. I thought it was the right thing to do. I didn't want to hurt anyone, but I was so afraid, Poirot. I was so afraid. Poirot looked down at him, his expression a mixture of pity and determination. Fear, Monsieur Laurent, is a powerful motivator, but it is not the truth. And the truth, as always, has a way of revealing itself, no matter how deeply it is buried. The air in the room grew thick with the weight of Laurent's confession. The broken vow of a gardener had led to the death of a man, a death that had been covered in layers of deception, each one more tangled than the last. But now, Poirot knew the truth. It was a truth that would shatter the carefully constructed illusion that had kept everyone in the dark for so long. And now, Monsieur Laurent, Poirot continued, his voice firm but calm, the time has come to face the consequences of your actions. You cannot escape the truth, no matter how hard you try. Laurent's shoulders slumped as the full weight of his guilt settled upon him. He had broken a vow, and now he would pay the price. Poirot stood tall, his mind already moving toward the next step in this complex puzzle. The truth had been uncovered, but there was still more to uncover, more lies to unravel, more secrets to expose. The storm outside had passed, but the storm within this house, the storm of betrayal, guilt, and deception, was only just beginning. Chapter 9, A Shadow in the Rosebed. The moonlight filtered through the thick curtains, casting a cold, pale glow across the room. The stillness of the night was broken only by the occasional creak of the floorboards beneath the weight of unseen footsteps. But it was the rosebed outside the window that caught Poirot's attention, as it had done every night since his arrival. The roses, still in bloom despite the season, swayed gently in the breeze, their dark petals whispering secrets to the shadows that clung to their stems. Poirot's eyes narrowed. There was something wrong with the garden, something that had eluded him until now. But that unmistakable feeling of unease had been lingering in the air for days. Tonight, however, the shadows seemed deeper than usual, as though they held a truth that the flowers themselves were trying to hide. A soft sound broke through his thoughts, a faint rustle, a whisper of movement that no one else seemed to hear. Poirot's sharp gaze flicked toward the rosebed once again. There it was, a shadow. It moved with the grace of someone trying to avoid being seen, but Poirot had already caught the silhouette. A figure, dark and elusive, slipping between the rows of roses, its form blending seamlessly with the night. But Poirot was no fool. He saw the truth in the movement, the subtle way the figure paused and turned, as though listening for the slightest sound. The air in the room seemed to grow heavier as he took a slow, deliberate step toward the window. His mind worked quickly, assessing the possibilities. A shadow in the rosebed, a fleeting presence that seemed almost too perfect to be real. And yet Poirot knew it was as real as the danger that loomed just outside. He moved silently across the room, his footsteps soft against the floor, his movements measured and precise. The figure in the garden had not yet noticed him, but Poirot had already seen enough. He knew who was out there, and he knew what that shadow meant. He reached the window, his hand resting lightly on the handle as he peered through the glass. The figure had stopped moving, standing motionless among the roses, its eyes darting around as though searching for something or someone. Poirot's sharp gaze caught the faintest hint of recognition. The figure was not a stranger to this place. No, this was someone who belonged here, someone who had lived among the thorns and petals for far too long. Poirot turned away from the window, his mind already racing with deductions. There were too many unanswered questions, too many suspicions that had yet to be addressed. The rose bed, with its twisted beauty, had become the center of this mystery, a place where secrets festered and where every petal hid the truth behind its fragile exterior. A knock at the door broke his concentration, and he turned to face the intruder, his mind already shifting gears. It was Vivian Mallory, her face pale and drawn, her eyes shadowed by something darker than mere fatigue. "Monsieur Poirot," she said, her voice barely above a whisper, "I need to speak with you." Poirot raised an eyebrow, his gaze piercing as he studied her. "Ah, Mademoiselle Mallory, of course. You have come to reveal to me the truth, yes? The truth that you have so carefully hidden beneath your veil of silence." Vivian's lips trembled, and she looked down at the floor, avoiding his gaze. I'm afraid I don't know how much more I can keep pretending. It's all falling apart. Everything." Her voice broke on the last word, and she looked up at him, her eyes wide with a mix of fear and desperation. "There is someone out there. Someone I don't know. Someone who's been watching me." Poirot tilted his head slightly, his expression calm but focused. "Someone? Mademoiselle, you are not the first to mention this shadow in the rose bed. I have seen it myself. But tell me, do you know who this figure is?" Vivian hesitated, her fingers twisting together nervously. No, I don't know, but I have my suspicions." She looked at Poirot, her eyes pleading. "It's my husband, isn't it? You've already figured it out. You know what happened." Poirot's gaze softened just slightly, but his voice remained firm. "Mademoiselle, your husband's death was not a simple affair, but I am afraid that the answer you seek does not lie with him." He paused, watching her closely. "No, mademoiselle, the answer lies within you. It is you who hold the key to this mystery, whether you are ready to admit it or not." Vivian's face paled further, her hand reaching for the back of a nearby chair for support. I don't understand. What do you mean? What key? What have I done?" Poirot's eyes locked onto hers, his voice calm, but with a gravity that was impossible to ignore. "The key, mademoiselle, is buried deep within your past, a past that you have tried so desperately to keep hidden, and it is that very past that has led us here, led us to this moment, to this shadow in the rose bed." Vivian recoiled slightly, as though struck by a sudden realization. Her breath quickened, and she stumbled backward, her hand going to her mouth. No, it can't be. You're wrong, Poirot. You're wrong." Poirot stepped toward her, his expression unchanging. "I am not wrong, mademoiselle. I have seen the signs. I have noticed the small things that others have missed. The shadow, yes, but also the broken vow of a gardener, the deceit in the garden, and the blood-red rose. All of these things point to one conclusion." He paused, allowing the weight of his words to sink in. "You were not a helpless bystander, mademoiselle. You were a participant in your husband's death, and now you must face the consequences." The room was thick with tension, the weight of Poirot's words settling heavily between them. Vivian trembled, her hands clutching the chair for support, her eyes wide with disbelief. "No, no, I didn't." "But you did," Poirot interrupted gently. "You did, mademoiselle. You may not have committed the act directly, but you set the events in motion. Your husband's death was no accident. It was the culmination of a plan that began long before that shadow appeared in the rosebed." Vivian collapsed into the chair, her face buried in her hands. The sound of her sobs echoed through the room, a raw, desperate sound that seemed to rip through the silence that had hung so heavily around them. Poirot stood quietly, his gaze steady as he watched her. There was no judgment in his eyes, only the quiet resolution that he had come to expect in moments like this. In the distance, the shadow in the rosebed had disappeared. The figure was gone, leaving behind only the faintest trace of its presence. But Poirot knew. He knew that the truth had been revealed at last. "Monsieur Poirot," Vivienne whispered, her voice barely audible through her tears. "I never wanted this. I never wanted any of this to happen." Poirot's voice was low, his words steady and unyielding. "Mademoiselle Mallory, the past has a way of catching up with us. It always does. The shadow you see is not just the one you saw in the garden. It is the shadow of your actions, of your choices, and it has followed you, just as it will follow all who seek to hide from the truth." Vivian looked up at him, her face a picture of exhaustion and guilt. "What now?" she whispered, her voice broken. Poirot's gaze softened, just for a moment, before his eyes narrowed with the cold clarity of a mind that never stopped working. "Now, mademoiselle, now the truth must be set free. You must face it, just as I have faced it, just as we all must. Only then will the shadow in the rosebed be finally put to rest." With that, Poirot turned and walked to the window, his gaze once more falling on the rosebed. The garden had been a place of beauty and deception, and now it would be the place where the truth would bloom. The moonlight bathed the garden in a soft, haunting glow, casting long shadows that stretched across the flowers, as though the night itself were hiding something. But Poirot knew better. The truth was no longer hidden. It was out in the open, ready to be faced. And as the final whispers of the night faded away, Poirot knew that the game was almost over. The shadow in the rosebed had been revealed, and soon the last pieces of this intricate puzzle would fall into place. The final truth would come to light, and those who had tried to hide behind their lies would have nowhere left to run. Chapter 10. The Heart of the Blooming Lie. The clock struck midnight, its chimes reverberating through the silence of the house like a warning, or perhaps a call to the inevitable. Outside, the wind howled through the trees, the storm that had raged earlier, now only a distant memory. Inside, however, the air was still, thick, suffocating, and laden with the scent of secrets long buried beneath the veneer of politeness. Poirot stood at the window, his sharp eyes scanning the shadows that stretched across the garden. The moon, high in the sky, bathed the rosebed in a pale, eerie light. The roses, still blooming in defiance of the season, seemed to reach toward the heavens, their petals dark and rich, but concealing beneath them the fatal deceit that had taken root. It was in that moment, as the storm began to subside and the wind carried away the last vestiges of tension, that Poirot understood. The roses were the key. They were the metaphor for the lie that had been nurtured in this house, the heart of the blooming lie. And like the roses, it had flourished in silence, hidden beneath layers of falsehood, only to reveal itself when it was too late to stop its destructive bloom. Turning away from the window, Poirot faced the room, and the woman seated in the chair. Vivian Mallory, her face pale, her hands clenched tightly in her lap, seemed to shrink beneath the weight of the truth she had been avoiding. The tension in the room was palpable, thick, enough to cut with a knife. She had been a part of this lie, whether she knew it or not. But now, as the pieces of the puzzle began to fall into place, it was clear. She was not the victim, but the orchestrator. Mademoiselle Mallory, Poirot began, his voice calm, measured, yet with a weight that conveyed his certainty. You have been hiding the truth, have you not? A lie so beautiful and perfect that it bloomed in your heart. But like all lies, it will wither and die when the truth comes to light. Vivian's lips parted, but no sound came out. Her eyes darted to the door, then back to Poirot, as if seeking an escape, an answer, anything to avoid facing the reality of his words. She had been deceived, yes, but only by her own hand. The heart of the lie was not in the murder, not in the death of her husband, but in the lie that had been crafted to cover it up. You see, Poirot continued, stepping closer to her, his voice gentle but firm, you thought you could bury the truth. You thought you could keep it hidden beneath layers of falsehood, beneath the blooming roses, beneath the guise of innocence. But, mademoiselle, the heart of the lie is like the core of the rose, hidden, yes, but unmistakable to the trained eye. Vivian looked up at him then, her eyes filled with a mixture of confusion, desperation, and something else, something darker. I didn't mean to, she started, but her words trailed off, swallowed by the weight of the moment. Poirot's gaze softened just for a moment, but his words were sharp. Ah, but you did mean to, mademoiselle. You may not have intended the consequences, but you knew what you were doing. You knew that your husband's death, though tragic, was a means to an end, a means that you had a hand in creating. Vivian's face crumpled in anguish. She dropped her face into her hands, her shoulders trembling with silent sobs. Poirot remained silent, watching her carefully. He knew that the truth, when it finally came, would be as painful as it was inevitable. But the truth, no matter how excruciating, was the only thing that could set them all free. Do you know what you have done, Mademoiselle Mallory? Poirot asked softly. You have created a web, and now the strands of that web are tightening around you. You wanted your husband gone, did you not? But you wanted it to look like something else. A tragic accident, a heart attack, perhaps. Something that would explain his sudden death without arousing suspicion. Vivian's breath hitched, and she looked up at him, her eyes wide with fear. No, that's not true. I didn't. Poirot raised a hand, silencing her with a quiet but authoritative gesture. Ah, but it is true, mademoiselle, and I can prove it. The poisoned rose, the strange behavior of the gardener, the lies you have told. These are the threads that have led me to this moment. A moment where the truth can no longer be avoided. Vivian's eyes darted toward the rosebed outside the window, as if seeking some sort of reassurance from the garden. But Poirot's gaze was unflinching. He could see her now clearly for what she was, not the grieving widow, not the helpless woman trapped in a marriage she couldn't escape, but the architect of a calculated plan to remove the one obstacle that had stood between her and her desires. You see, mademoiselle, Poirot continued, the heart of the blooming lie is not in the flowers, but in the very core of your actions. You took a man's life, but you thought you could get away with it. You thought you could hide behind the veil of grief and innocence, and no one would question your role in this tragedy. Vivian recoiled, her face pale, her breath coming in shallow gasps. She had hoped, desperately hoped, that the truth would remain buried forever. But Poirot had found it, as he always did. The lie, like the rose, had bloomed, but now it was wilting, its beauty fading with each passing moment. Monsieur Poirot, Vivienne began, but her voice faltered, choked by her own guilt. You are guilty, mademoiselle, Poirot said quietly, his voice softer now, almost sympathetic. But it is not just your guilt that has brought you here. It is the way you have deceived yourself, the way you have convinced yourself that what you did was for the greater good. You convinced yourself that your actions were justified, that the ends would justify the means. Vivienne collapsed back into the chair, her face buried in her hands once again. Her sobs filled the room, raw and anguished, as though the weight of the truth had broken her in ways nothing else could. Poirot stood silently, watching her, allowing her the space to confront the consequences of her own actions. After a long moment, Vivian looked up, her face streaked with tears, her eyes wild with desperation. What do I do now? She whispered, her voice breaking. What can I do? It's too late. It's all falling apart. Poirot's expression softened slightly, but his voice remained calm. Now, mademoiselle, you must face what you have done. You must face the consequences of your choices. The heart of the lie, the one you have carried for so long, is now laid bare. And it is only by confronting the truth that you can hope to make things right. Vivian's gaze shifted toward the window, toward the garden, where the roses bloomed in the moonlight, their beauty now tinged with darkness. I wanted to be free, she said quietly, almost to herself. I thought, if I just removed him, everything would be better. I never thought it would lead to this. Poirot stepped closer, his voice gentle but firm. Mademoiselle, that is the problem with lies. They grow, they bloom, and they spread. They create something beautiful on the surface, but underneath they are rotting away, feeding on your guilt, your fear, and eventually they must be confronted. The truth must be revealed. Vivienne looked up at him, her face pale, her eyes haunted. And what now? Will you tell them? Will you expose me? Poirot hesitated for a moment, his gaze steady. I will not expose you, mademoiselle, not yet. But you must understand, the truth will always find its way out. It will reveal itself, whether you are ready or not. And when it does, it will be the only thing left standing. As he turned toward the door, Poirot's voice lingered in the room, a final, weighty thought that would stay with Vivienne long after he had gone. Remember, mademoiselle, lies may bloom, but they always wither. The heart of the lie may be hidden for a time, but it cannot escape the light of truth forever. With those words, Poirot left the room, his mind already moving toward the next chapter in this complex web of deceit. The lie had bloomed, but now it was time for the truth to take root. And when the truth bloomed, it would leave no space for anything else. Chapter 11. A murder that smells of roses. The scent of roses was thick in the air, so overpowering it seemed to smother everything else in the room. The heavy perfume lingering like a final, fatal reminder of the crime that had just been committed. But it wasn't the fragrance that had sent a chill down Poirot's spine. It was the sight that greeted him as he stepped into the study. There, in the center of the room, lay the body of Charles Davies, his lifeless form sprawled across the floor. His face, pale and frozen in a grimace, was half concealed by a blanket of red roses, their petals soft but stained by the blood that pooled beneath him. The roses, so perfect in their bloom, now seemed to mock the scene, mock the life that had once thrived in this very place. Poirot stood still for a moment, his gaze fixed on the flowers that surrounded the body. They had been placed deliberately, arranged with care, almost as if the murderer had sought to create a macabre tableau. The petals, once beautiful and innocent, had become part of the crime, a symbol of the twisted intentions that had brought them all to this point. Monsieur Poirot, a voice broke through the stillness. It was Vivienne Mallory, her face pale with shock, her eyes wide and unseeing. "He's dead, isn't he? Charles, he's dead." Poirot turned to face her, his expression calm, but his mind already working at full speed, analyzing the scene with the precision that only he could bring. Vivienne stood near the door, her hands trembling at her sides, her face contorted with a mix of grief and fear. She was the widow, and yet her emotions seemed forced, as though she were playing a role rather than truly experiencing the devastation of loss. "Ah, Mademoiselle Mallory," Poirot said softly, his voice carrying the weight of both sympathy and suspicion. "You are correct. Monsieur Davies is dead. But I must ask you, do you mourn him, or do you mourn something else? Something more personal?" Vivienne flinched, her eyes narrowing as though she were trying to suppress the surge of emotions that had begun to rise within her. "What do you mean?" she asked, her voice tight with restrained emotion. "What are you suggesting?" Poirot's sharp eyes studied her carefully. "I suggest, mademoiselle, that this is not a simple crime of passion. No, this is a carefully calculated murder, a murder that smells of roses." Her lips parted, but no words came out. Poirot could see the flicker of panic in her eyes, the way she struggled to maintain control over her emotions. It was a familiar pattern, one he had seen before in many of his cases. The mask of grief that people wore when they were guilty, when they were caught in the web of their own lies. "Monsieur Poirot," she said, her voice trembling slightly now, "you must understand. Charles and I, we had our differences, but I would never have wanted him dead." Poirot stepped closer, his gaze never leaving hers. "Ah, but you did want him dead, mademoiselle. Not in the way that you might think, not in the way that a murderer would normally act. No, you wanted him gone. And that, mademoiselle, is the heart of the matter." Vivienne's face paled further, and for a moment Poirot thought she might collapse, her legs giving way beneath her. But she managed to steady herself, her back straightening with a sense of forced composure. "I don't understand what you're saying," she whispered, her voice barely audible now. Poirot's gaze shifted from her to the body on the floor, his eyes narrowing as he took in every detail. The arrangement of roses around Charles Davies' body was no accident. It was too deliberate, too thoughtful to be a mere coincidence. Someone had taken the time to arrange the flowers with care, as though they were honoring a final wish. But the question remained: who had arranged them? Who had placed them so carefully, with such macabre precision? "The roses," Poirot said, his voice barely above a whisper. "They were meant to cover up something. They were meant to hide the truth. And yet, in the end, they reveal it." He turned back to Vivienne, his eyes piercing. Tell me, mademoiselle, what was it that you were hiding? What was it that you hoped no one would discover? Vivienne's eyes darted to the door, as if seeking a way out, a way to escape the question that Poirot had just asked. "I don't know what you mean," she repeated. But her voice lacked conviction, her words hanging in the air like a lie that had been told too many times. Poirot took another step closer, his gaze unwavering. "You know, mademoiselle, you know exactly what I mean. The roses, the way they are arranged, the blood that stains them. This was not an act of passion. This was a calculated decision, and it was made by someone who understood the power of deception." Vivienne took a step back, her face a mask of terror and confusion. "No," she whispered, shaking her head. "I couldn't." "But you could, mademoiselle," Poirot interrupted, his voice firm and unyielding. "You could, because you were the one who planned it. You were the one who sought to remove the man who stood between you and what you truly desired." Vivienne's eyes darted to the rosebed again, the shadows beneath the flowers seeming to shift as though they held more than just petals and leaves. Poirot could see it then, the fear, the realization that the truth was slipping through her fingers, that the lies she had woven were unraveling faster than she could control them. "You wanted him gone," Poirot said, his voice calm, but carrying the weight of certainty. "You wanted him gone so you could have everything for yourself. You thought that no one would suspect, that you could hide behind your grief, your innocence. But you underestimated me, mademoiselle. You underestimated the power of observation, the ability to see through the veil of lies that you have so carefully woven." Vivienne's face crumpled, her breath coming in ragged gasps. "I never wanted it to go this far," she sobbed. "I never meant for anyone to get hurt. I just wanted to be free." Poirot's expression softened slightly, but his voice remained steady, firm. "Ah, mademoiselle, freedom is a powerful temptation, but it is also dangerous. It blinds us to the consequences of our actions. You did not want to kill him, no, but you wanted him out of your life. And when that desire is strong enough, it can cloud the judgment." Vivienne sank to her knees, her sobs echoing in the stillness of the room. "I didn't mean it. I didn't want him to die like this. I just wanted him gone." Poirot watched her for a moment longer, before turning back to the body on the floor. The roses, now drenched in the faintest trace of blood, seemed to whisper their own tale of deceit and death. The plan had been simple, too simple. The flowers had been meant to cover the truth, to disguise the murder as something natural, something that could be explained away. But nothing escapes Poirot's notice. "Mademoiselle," Poirot said softly, "this murder did not smell of roses. It smelled of desperation. It smelled of a lie that had grown too big, too heavy to carry. And now, the truth is here. The roses have bloomed, and the heart of the lie has been revealed." Vivienne's sobs softened, her body trembling, as she finally allowed herself to confront the weight of her actions. But it was too late for regret. The deed had been done, and now the consequences would follow. Poirot stepped away from her, his gaze sweeping over the room one last time, his mind already turning to the final pieces of the puzzle. The heart of the blooming lie had been exposed, and in the end, it was not the roses that had covered the truth, but the person who had planted them. As Poirot turned to leave, he glanced back one last time at the body on the floor, surrounded by the dying roses. "Ah, but mademoiselle," he murmured to himself, "the lies we plant always bloom, but they never last. With that, Poirot left the room, the weight of the truth pressing down on him as he moved forward, knowing that justice, though delayed, would always find its way. Chapter 12. The final petal falls. The clock in the hall struck 1, its chimes reverberating through the empty corridors like the final toll of an ancient bell. The house was silent now. The storm that had battered the windows earlier reduced to a faint whisper. Yet in the air there was still a tension, as though the house itself was holding its breath, waiting for something that would soon come to pass. Poirot stood by the window, his eyes focused on the rosebed outside. The roses had been the focal point of this entire mystery, their blooming beauty now a painful reminder of the lies, the betrayal, and the murder that had woven through the lives of those inside these walls. One petal, the final one, drifted from the stem of a rose, its descent slow, almost deliberate. It landed on the ground with a soft thud, like the closing of a chapter, the end of a story that had twisted and turned, only to arrive at a singular, inevitable conclusion. Poirot's gaze never wavered from the fallen petal, his mind already racing, assembling the final pieces of the puzzle. He turned from the window, his expression calm, but filled with the quiet intensity of a man who had already solved the mystery. "Mademoiselle Mallory," he said, his voice measured, precise, "I believe the time has come for the final petal to fall, yes? The truth is now clear." Vivian Mallory stood across from him, her face pale, her hands trembling. The storm that had raged in her heart for so long was now almost over, and she could no longer deny the weight of the truth that hung in the air between them. She opened her mouth to speak, but no words came. She simply stood there, frozen, as though waiting for Poirot to confirm the terrible truth. "Yes, mademoiselle," Poirot continued, his voice soft but firm. "The time has come for us to face the reality of what has happened here. You see, the rosebed, this garden, has been a metaphor, has it not? A place where beauty and lies have bloomed side by side, each pretending to be something it is not." Vivian's lips trembled, but she said nothing. Poirot's eyes never left her as he spoke, his mind calculating the twists and turns that had brought them to this moment. "It was you, mademoiselle, who orchestrated this entire affair," Poirot said, his tone still gentle, but filled with the certainty of a man who had already seen the truth. "Not directly, no. You did not commit the murder yourself, but you played a part in it, a critical part. You created the environment in which this tragedy could unfold. You who sought to escape a life of constraint, of duty, and of unwanted obligations. You were the one who planted the seed of destruction." Vivian's face crumpled, and she sank into the chair behind her, her hands pressing against her forehead as if trying to push away the weight of Poirot's words. "I didn't mean for it to go this far," she whispered, her voice broken. "I never wanted anyone to die. I never thought it would come to this." Poirot stepped closer, his gaze softening just slightly, though his words remained firm. "You did not want him dead, mademoiselle, but you wanted him gone. You wanted him removed from your life so that you could live freely. And in that desire, you began to believe that anything, any action, was justifiable. You convinced yourself that it was the only way." Vivian's eyes filled with tears, and for a moment, she was silent, her gaze fixed on the floor. "It wasn't supposed to be like this," she said, her voice barely a whisper. "I didn't want him dead. I wanted him to leave. I just wanted him to go away. Poirot's eyes sharpened, his voice gaining a subtle edge. And yet, mademoiselle, it was not enough for you to ask him to leave. No, you wanted more. You wanted him out of the way, completely, permanently. You sought out a solution, a way to rid yourself of the man who was standing between you and your desires. The roses, those roses were part of your plan, weren't they? Vivienne's head snapped up, her eyes wide with disbelief. The roses, she repeated, her voice shaking. What do you mean? What are you talking about? Poirot's gaze remained steady, unwavering. The roses were the means by which you sought to deceive. You wanted to make his death look like an accident, didn't you? A natural cause, something that could be explained away. But you chose the roses, mademoiselle. You chose them for their beauty, for their symbolism. But they were not just a cover. They were a trap. Vivienne stood up abruptly, her breath coming in shallow gasps. No, she cried, her voice rising in desperation. You're wrong. You're wrong about everything. I didn't. Poirot raised his hand, silencing her with the calm authority that only he could command. No, mademoiselle, I am not wrong. I know what I am saying. The roses, the gardener, the secret. You tried so desperately to hide. They were all part of the same plan. And now, the final petal has fallen. Vivienne collapsed back into the chair, her hands trembling uncontrollably. I never wanted it to happen, she whispered. I never meant for anyone to die. Poirot regarded her with a mixture of sympathy and resolve. Ah, but you see, mademoiselle, intent does not change the outcome. You were part of the scheme, whether you meant it or not. And in your quest for freedom, you have found yourself trapped. The rosebed has become your prison, the lie you cultivated now, strangling you in its thorns. Vivienne's sobs filled the room, her shoulders shaking, as the truth, so long denied, finally broke through the dam of her defenses. I wanted him to leave, she whispered, her voice barely audible. I thought if he was gone, everything would be different. But I didn't think it would end like this. I didn't think it would end in death. Poirot's voice softened, but his words remained steady. You wanted him gone, mademoiselle, and in the end, you got what you wanted. But it came at a price that you must now pay. Vivienne looked up at him, her eyes filled with both fear and a sense of resignation. What? What will happen now? She whispered. Poirot's gaze softened just slightly, though his voice remained firm. Now, mademoiselle, you must face the consequences of your actions. The lie has bloomed, and now it is time for the truth to reveal itself. You cannot escape it. The final petal has fallen, and with it, the last of your illusions. Vivienne lowered her head, her hands clasped tightly in her lap, as though she were trying to hold herself together. The weight of Poirot's words pressed down on her like an immovable force. There was no escape now. The truth had come, and she had no choice but to face it. Poirot turned toward the door, his mind already shifting toward the final step of the investigation. The pieces had fallen into place. The lies, the secrets, the rosebed. It was all clear now. But there was one last thing that remained. The last twist. As Poirot reached for the door, he paused and turned back to Vivienne. You see, mademoiselle, the heart of the blooming lie has been exposed. But lies have a way of revealing themselves in the most unexpected ways. And sometimes, the truth is not what we expect it to be. With that, Poirot stepped into the hallway, leaving Vivienne, alone with her tears and the weight of the consequences that were now inevitable. The final petal had fallen, and with it, the final chapter in this twisted tale was written. The truth had come to light, and now there was nothing left to hide. The house was still. The storm outside had passed, but inside, the air was thick with the weight of the truth.